This is Chapter 7 notes, and first thing we're going to do is step back a little bit. So you don't need to put this on your checklist for Unit 2 because these key concepts are from Unit 1. Because Zoroastrianism was started during the first time period, early civs, but it isn't influential until this time period when we have the Persian empires. And your book puts it in Unit 2, even though the College Board put it in Unit 1. So right here we have the key concepts for Unit 1 that mentions Zoroastrianism, which is the first thing we're going to talk about. The first thing you need to know about Zoroastrianism, it was started by Zoroaster, who is also called Zarathustra, or something like that. And the reason we usually say Zoroaster instead of that is it's easier to pronounce. One of the key beliefs of Zoroastrianism is dualism. And there's two kinds of dualism. The kind that it has to do with cosmological things, with the universe, the heavens, as it were. And that has to do with gods, or God. So there's one God, Ahura Mazda, good God. But then there's a dark force, and that's Angra Manu. So how do you remember that? Well, Mazda is a half-decent car, so that's good. So Ahura Mazda, good God. And Angra Manu sounds like anger, and that's bad. So that's one way I always remember it. Moral dualism is more about mankind. And so, according to Zoroastrianism, we have free will, and we can choose good stuff, we can go on a path of righteousness, or we can follow evil. And if we choose evil, that will lead to misery and ultimately a hell. And righteousness will lead to some sort of heaven where there's peace. Now, if any of this sounds familiar to you, some historians believe that Zoroastrianism greatly influenced Christianity. So much so that if you know the story of the Nativity when Jesus is born, one of the groups of people that comes to visit the manger where Jesus is born are the three kings, and in some translation, the three magi. Magis are Zoroastrians. And so there's a connection already in the biblical text to Zoroastrianism. But again, this is important to historians, but if you're a believer, you might not see necessarily that connection. Here we have the symbol of Zoroastrianism. So it's a man with sort of a large winged bird, probably like a phoenix or an eagle, having these large wings. This slide is pretty self-explanatory. Here we have the different Persian empires, and you might notice that there's two snakes on the side. Those are asps. That's the kind of snake they are, and ASP is the acronym that I use to help you remember what the empires are in the classical age. First is the Achaemenid, which we're going to spend most of our time talking about. Then there's the Seleucid, that is another one of Alexander the Great's empires. Then there's the Parthians, and the Sassanids are the last Persian empire before Islam sweeps through the area. For almost every civilization that we're going to look at, you need to know where it is. So this is the map of the Achaemenid Empire. Now, the central part of that is Persia, which today we call Iran, but most people from Iran call themselves Persians, not Iranians. But it also includes all of the Fertile Crescent, so Iraq into Lebanon, down into Israel. And it will have parts of Egypt and Turkey as well. The Achaemenid Empire, one of the things that the Persians end up really being good at is having a centralized government. And we've talked about how the Chinese were really good at this because of Confucianism. So they don't have so much of philosophy about it, but they organize it well and turn out to be some of the better bureaucrats in human history. So they had 23 satrapies, which were governors, that were appointed by the central government and then reported back to the central government. And there was an allowing for local officials to have some say, and especially when there were diverse populations. So like the Jewish people in Israel had some say in the government. And so they also were checked, these satrapies, in case they decided to go out on their own, by the military. So the next bullet talks about something called tribute. So what's tribute? So tribute is a system where like a government takes over another territory, but they don't really want to govern it. So the country that's taken over pays them like a gift, which is the tribute of money, just to keep the more powerful neighbors who took them over from taking over. Now, this system isn't particularly great for keeping lands you take over in line, and it's also not that great for keeping a lot of money in the government. So the Persians started expanding and started doing tribute, but then as time went on, they moved to a tax system using their bureaucrats to collect the taxes, and that worked much better. Now, you probably should have written all that tribute stuff down. The last couple things on the slide are about standardization. So we talked about this before. So they made a standard Persian coin. You can see one of those on the right. They made standard laws. But probably the most significant thing were the royal roads. They built these roads to improve military, but also to improve trade. And we've already talked about how that impacts the Silk Roads in other chapters. But also they created kind of a courier system to improve communication, which in the end made the government stronger. Another important thing that the Achaemenid government did was create these underground canals called qanats, which they used for agriculture, but also to feed fountains and feed or make sure that people had water to drink. And they put them underground because much of the Persian Empire is in a hot climate, which stops evaporation. But the really interesting thing, if you look at the picture at the top right, is that around 400 BCE, the Persians figured out how to store ice in the desert. And that's what that structure is. The other structure is just inside the canal, and then a fountain that comes out from the qanat. Here we have a map of the royal roads that I mentioned earlier, but notice they only go from basically Turkey down towards the Mesopotamian area and hooks up with the rivers. Alright, this slide has some important rulers of the Persian Empire, particularly the Achaemenid. So Cyrus is the first one who unites the Persian tribes and takes all of Iran under control. His son, don't care about so much. But Darius, the next one, he made the Persian Empire the largest in the Achaemenid time period. And he had a lot of ethnicities and a lot of diversity in his empire. He also is the one who started the war with the Greeks, which will continue on to Xerxes, who also fought with the Greeks. And it causes some problems for the Persian Empire, or specifically the Achaemenid Empire. Persepolis is found here on the map, so sort of a little off the main royal road, but it becomes the capital and cultural capital, ceremonial capital. Over here we have pictures from Persepolis. So they had a lot of columns. A lot of it was destroyed by Alexander the Great. But if you look at the left, you can always tell a picture is Persian, or at least from the Middle East, because of the way these beards are made. They're these little circular beards, is kind of how they're decorated. On the next slide, we have a picture, the big picture on the left, some sort of griffin figure, which shows sort of a mystical ceremonial aspect to it. On the top right, you see specifically that is called a griffin on the left-hand part of that picture, and below is that symbol of Zoroastrian, because after all, the Achaemenids are Zoroastrians. Alright, on this first slide, you see what basically you have in your notes, the hierarchy written out. On the next slide, It talks a little bit more about the various structures. So first of all, new in this time period with the creation of the Achaemenid Empire are actually bureaucrats. So they have to be put on the social class. But basically, most people in the Persian empires were free people. So in other words, they weren't slaves. They weren't obliged to do the kind of work that they were doing. They just did it freely. So in the city, that would be like skilled tradespeople who are called artisans or craftsmen, also merchants, but also those imperial bureaucrats. In the countryside, you have peasants who also build all those qanats. But there's also a very large class of slaves who, we're going to talk about slavery a lot. In most cultures, at most times, slaves were prisoners of war or they were paying off debts. All right, this economic slide says that agriculture was the foundation of the economy of the Achaemenids and all the Persians, which is true. It's specifically important to know that in the Fertile Crescent they grew wheat, which the Persians now own. They also had a huge area to trade with. They traded all the way from India to Egypt, and they were located on several trade routes. So the Silk Roads go through there. They're on the Mediterranean Sea. They had access to the Indian Ocean through the Persian Gulf and Red Sea. And through Egypt, they had access to the trans-Saharan trade routes, which were just starting at the tail end of this time period. I don't have a lot to say about the slide other than crops spread through trade routes such as rice and cotton from India, which is in South Asia, to the Middle East, in this case Persia, which changed farming, and then we need irrigation for these new crops, and that's why they started building the qanats. All right, so everybody's patriarchal, and so are the Persians. Men are considered greater than, but Persian women are doing slightly better than a lot of other places at the time. So they will have some rights, and they are listed here on this slide. Like all great empires, the Achaemenid Empire falls. So beginning of the fall is with Xerxes, who had problems with tolerating the diversity in Persia. He caused some bad feelings and rebellions in Mesopotamian Egypt. He didn't do so well in the Persian wars with the Greeks, and neither did Darius before him, so that caused some problems. But what eventually brings down the Achaemenid Empire is Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great is going to come in, destroy the empire, and then replace it with his own, called the Seleucid. Alright, here is the same slide we had before. We just saw the fall of the Achaemenid Empire and talked about how the Seleucid was one of Alexander the Great's Hellenistic empires. After that falls, and the Parthians, who are sort of half in, half out of the Persian Empire, attack and take over the whole thing. And the very last Persian Empire are called the Sassanids. They're going to go to war with the Romans, but they're going to be the last Zoroastrian Empire in Persia and will fall when Islam rises.